1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
8 games.
The final calculations show just how deadly the sling can be. Ron found that the stone reached about 30 meters per second. That's nearly 80 miles an hour.
Well, the results are quite surprising. Given its fairly heavy mass, it would have a kinetic energy, say an impact energy, that's on a par with a medieval longbow arrow or even a modern 2-2 bullet. Now, these are certainly killing devices. They would go through soft tissue, they would certainly crack bone, they would possibly penetrate bone, and if they hit the right spot, they would certainly be lethal.
As David and Goliath met in battle, it was the shepherd boy, not the giant, who had the upper hand. With one blow, David is victorious. Then a final act reveals him to be very knowledgeable of the battle traditions of his day.
David took the head of Goliath and Goliath's weapons as trophies of the defeat of the enemy. A trophy is taken for display to terrify the enemy, to demonstrate the power of us who killed the other guy.
There's more to David's battle with Goliath than meets the eye. And that's true of almost everything about this man. The latest research shows that he may have been more ruthless and ambitious than the Bible portrait allows.
We look at David typically through the lens of a canonization that's taken place over millennia. And so David becomes a sort of a plaster saint. But the historical David is a character who was willing to take chances. He didn't get to power without running through a lot of other people on the way.
To find out what kind of person he really was, scholars are now looking at the stories in a revolutionary way. They've found that modern politics can shed light on biblical events. The reputations of today's politicians are managed by spin doctors who manipulate information to persuade us to accept their version of the truth. Historian Steve Mackenzie believes the same may be true of the biblical writers.
The biblical writers are often compared to spin doctors. Spin doctors paint a picture, a portrait of a politician's words and ideas and motives and so on, and also control, to some degree, release of information. That would have been true even more so in the ancient world, which didn't have newspapers and so on.
In order to get to the David behind the spin, historians believe it's essential not to take the Bible's account at face value.
Why dig beneath the surface of the biblical account? Because the account that we read is an interpretation, a spin, on a series of events that occurred in the 10th century BC. I'm a historian, and a historian's job is to undo the spin.
Using this method, historians are now taking a closer look at the biblical claims about David. One of the most famous is that he was a master musician. His instrument was the lyre, a small harp. Bo Lauergren is an expert in recreating musical instruments of the ancient world. Although no actual lyres from the time of David survive in Israel, contemporary illustrations from Egypt have given Bo enough detail to recreate the kind of lyre he believes David would have played.
David's lyre probably looked like this model I have here. It is made of wood, entirely wooden arms, curved arms, wooden body, a hole in the bottom, it would be the sound hole, a wooden bridge, and tuning collars made of some kind of rope. It's difficult to know exactly what David's lyre would have sounded like. It depends on many things. For example, the composition of the string. Is it gut? Is it linen, or what is it? The thickness of the string and the tension in the tuning collar up here. So the sound that you hear here is probably very similar to David's lyre, but we can never be sure it's exactly the same.
David's lyre playing has shaped his legendary image as the music-loving hero. But some historians are reading between the lines of the biblical accounts. They believe that David's lyre playing sheds light on his true ambitions. They were in politics. Israel in 1000 BC was not a unified country. The Bible says it was divided between Judah in the south and an area known as Israel in the north. David lived in the south. But they came together to fight their joint enemy, the Philistines. Israel had chosen a king who led these ongoing battles. The Bible calls him Saul. He was known as a great warrior who suffered from dark moods. David was brought to court to play for him. It was his music that was said to lift Saul's spirits.
We know from today's music that music can have a great influence on our emotional life. We can have exciting music, we can have calming music. So it's very likely that it also happened during King David's time.
But what the Bible doesn't say is that David's music brought him huge political benefits.
In the biblical story, David's musical skills get him to the court, and his musical skills are specifically medicinal. They exorcise Saul's demons. They cure Saul of whatever is possessing him. This gives David enormous leverage at the court because he is indispensable to the king.
Of course, David didn't gain power with his musicianship alone. The shepherd boy was becoming a man. The battle with Goliath turned him into a hero. People even started to suggest that David was better than King Saul. Feeling threatened, Saul started to make attempts on David's life. So, the Bible says, David fled to the far south of Israel, then known as Judah. At this point, the Bible portrays David as the victim of Saul's paranoia. But modern research suggests that he used his exile for political purposes.
The Bible has it that Saul chased David from the court in a jealous rage. The reality has to be that he was in the south organizing a group of brigands, irregular forces, to build his power base. He was there to accumulate money, power, influence.
The most powerful man in Judah at the time was a clan chief called Nabal. And yet, within only a short time, David had become undisputed ruler. The Bible insists that David did nothing to instigate his own rise to power. His only link with the clan chief was to send a delegation of men to ask him for provisions. Nabal apparently refused. When the men returned empty-handed, an enraged David threatened to kill Nabal. But before he could act, the Bible says that Nabal was struck down by God. David replaced him as the most important man in Judah. Scholars believe that the biblical account is all too convenient.
It's hard not to suspect in reading that story that David may have been involved somehow in getting rid of Nabal simply because he had so much to gain, and in fact did gain so much from Nabal being out of the way.
It's a pattern which becomes increasingly familiar as David's career progresses.
There's going to be a series of deaths of important characters, a trail of bodies, as it were, on David's road to the throne. And in each case, David is the primary beneficiary.
If you look at the biblical text carefully, you can see that David, in reality, was not the David the tradition had developed. He wasn't the David of Michelangelo. He was a real human being in a rough racket in a rough neighborhood. He had to fight his way to power.
In the Bible, David does win power. He replaces Saul as king of Israel after Saul meets a tragic death on the battlefield. The story goes that David never actively challenged the king's power, but his actions suggest otherwise. In a surprising move, David goes to work for the sworn enemies of King Saul, the Philistines. The Bible is adamant that David remained loyal to the king. But joining the Philistines could be read as a treacherous move.
David's alliance with the Philistines opened a new front against Saul. The southern hill country became hostile to Saul in a way that it hadn't been when there was no David in it.
Saul managed to hold out against the Philistines for a while, but scholars believe that their alliance with David turned the tables on the king.
When he had to confront the Philistines to his west and David to his south, that ultimately led to his demise. It weakened him. I think David was the thing that did tip the balance and caused Saul's ultimate defeat.
Conveniently for David, Saul was killed on the battlefield, and David became king in his place. Suspiciously, the Bible insists that David played no part in Saul's death. It says David was so distraught at the news that he composed a lament in the king's memory. But experts are skeptical at just how genuine David's grief really was.
David laments Saul's death, but David laments the deaths of all his enemies. Maybe he really composed that poem, but if he did compose it, he must have been laughing all the way to the bank because he was the one who stood to pick up the pieces.
The Bible's statements of David's innocence are so frequent, many scholars now believe they may instead point to David's guilt.
Over and over and over again, the author seems to emphasize that David had nothing to do with Saul's death. David is far away from Saul when Saul dies. Why all this emphasis on David not having anything to do with Saul's death, unless perhaps the truth of the matter was that he was involved in some way?
The Bible claims that David did not commit a whole series of murders. To deny one murder might be unfortunate. To deny 2 murders, coincidence. To deny 8, 10, 12 murders, it's likely a pattern of behavior. You don't deny something of which you are not accused. Therefore, David was being accused of committing these murders.